Well, welcome to Whiteboard Wednesday. Today we're going to do an Old Testament survey, just an overview of the Old Testament so you get a better understanding. I know it's very difficult at times if you just jump into the Old Testament and start reading and trying to figure out who and what is happening. So I want to give you a big overview of that. So we call that giant overview a survey. So if you have ever heard the word Old Testament survey, that's what it means. It means a big overview of the story. And this will really help you understand and grasp the scope of the Old Testament. And so, surprise, surprise, where do you think the Old Testament begins? The book of beginnings, Genesis, but who or what is the first character in the beginning of the Bible? And you're right. In the beginning, who? Oh yeah, okay, you got it. God. The Bible makes no argument or defense for the existence of God. God doesn't need it. He's like, I'm here, I started it all, and I'm running the show. So, in the beginning, this is how the Bible starts. It starts with God. And God did something, right? God created the heavens and the earth. So we'll give ourselves an earth and some heavens. He creates heavens and the earth. 6 days he creates animals, creatures, everything in existence, man and woman. And from there, so we're moving along the book of Genesis. You get the creation, and then that's chapters 1 to 2 in Genesis. Chapter 3, we'll just put a down arrow. Something bad happened in Genesis chapter 3. And this is what we call the fall. And what happened was everything was good here. Remember, everything God created and it was good. It was good, good, good. Everything is good. And then the fall happened and basically bad, right? But sin entered the world. So here is the problem in the world is sin. That is the problem. So the Bible gives us a solution. Ultimately, it's Jesus Christ, the solution to the world's problem. And the world's problem is sin. And because of sin, the ramifications of death, disease, suffering, trials, hard work, pain and labor, a lot of bad stuff happens. So sin entered in. And after that, you get a couple other guys, Cain and Abel, the children of Adam and Eve. One of them murders the other one. And then we get our friend Noah. Noah comes in, right? He builds the large ark. This is, Genesis 6, 7, 8. You get Noah's ark. The world's flooded because of sin. Remember we said the problem was sin. Sin causes so much trouble. Then after Noah kind of establishes life again, and people are troublesome. So they build this Tower of Babel. And God doesn't like it. He says, look, you're supposed to go subdue the earth, go out. And God comes down, separates them by their languages, sends them off. And that's Genesis 1 through 11. So there's a whole lot of stuff that happens in Genesis 1 through 11 that establishes the beginning of Scripture. So you got God. He makes everything good, man and woman. Sin is the problem. We see really bad things. Noah is saved because of all the wickedness. And then Tower of Babel. So that's Genesis 1 through 11. Now, the story continues on. And in Genesis 12 is a key chapter in all of the Bible. And in Genesis 12, a man enters in. Abram is his name originally, and it's changed to Abraham. So in Genesis 12, we'll just call him the big A here. Abraham is entered in. And remember we said the problem was sin? Now, there's also a promise given right after in Genesis 3:15 that through the seed of the woman, basically salvation is going to come. But it's real big, real broad. And God now picks in Genesis 12 this man, Abraham. It says, through your family, all the world is going to be blessed. So the rest of the Old Testament is really about Abraham's family, the story of Abraham's family. So that's the big picture of the Old Testament. Now Abraham, he has a kid, Isaac. Isaac has a kid named Jacob. And Jacob has his name changed. And I don't know if you remember, or if you read, Jacob's name is changed to Israel. So if you've heard of Israel and the people of Israel, which is primarily all the people of the Old Testament that God is dealing with, that's what Jacob's name, was changed to by God. And Jacob had 12 sons, and these become the 12 tribes, the 12 family groups that come from Jacob. So the 12 tribes of Israel. And Genesis finishes off, Genesis 49, Genesis 50, with Jacob blessing these 12 tribes of Israel. And now the Old Testament continues on. So you had Abraham, he's the main guy, blessing's going to come through. Where does that blessing go to? Oh, it goes to Isaac. Oh, Isaac, who do you pass it on to? Oh, Jacob. And Jacob, in a sense, passes it on to Israel. Now, Israel, you got 12 tribes. That's not like a big thing. And God promised Abraham a big nation as well. Nations would come from him. So you got 12 tribes, not too big. Israel, these 12 tribes, they end up in Egypt. And for 400 years, they are in Egypt. If you remember Joseph, one of his kids. So Israel, these 12 tribes, they end up in Egypt for 400 years. And during that time, God, it's like an incubator stage for this nation, grows them and grows them while he's waiting for the other nations to kind of fill up on their wrath. And for 400 years, they grow and grow. And this space right here is Genesis to Exodus. And Exodus is like an exit. They are leaving being in Egypt, and they're going now to the promised land. And this land, we call it the promised ED, because Abraham was promised a land, and he was promised this special seed and these blessings. So now these people, this tribe of Israel, are going to enter into this promised land. And so during this time of their exodus, them leaving in the book of Exodus, this is where you've heard of the 10 plagues that comes upon Egypt, is during this transition. So they end up getting out, they cross the Red Sea. Wow, how awesome. And right after they cross the Red Sea, this is something we call, we don't call it, but Mount Sinai, this is where, and Moses was the leader here, right? Who leads them out? So Moses leads Israel out, this big group of people now, leads them out through the Red Sea, and God deals with them now, and he gives them something, and he gives it to Moses, and he passes it along. And we're introduced to, we call it the law, or the Mosaic law, the law that Moses was given. So they're given a law. Genesis is Exodus. They leave out, they get the law. Leviticus is dealing with the priest. And Numbers is kind of counting all the people. That's Numbers, right? Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers. So those first 5 books are like the major groundwork for the Old Testament. So Israel, through Moses, they get the law. Now what? Well, let's erase some more of the board. Now that they've received the law, God said, okay, go into this promised land, which is what we know of Israel today. Go into this promised land, probably more land included, but go in there, and this is how you're supposed to live. This is how I want you to conduct your life. And that law is basically like a giant, it's covenant, but it's a giant contract. And God says, if you do these things, good will happen to you. If you don't do these things, bad will happen to you. And Israel basically shook hands with God and said, we're on board. This is great. Now that law is how God interacts with Israel through the rest of their days. By this law, the prophets who come later, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, they come almost as attorneys, prosecuting attorneys, and saying, hey, you broke this law that you had contract with God, and remember the curses? That's what's going to happen. And it's like a warning system. But this is like their agreement with God. So anyways, God says, go into the promised land. And they send some people, one guy from each tribe, to check it out. And then 10 guys are like, we're scared of that. We don't want to do it. 2 guys said, yeah, let's do it. And God was basically like, why did you doubt me? And they got scared, so they took a vote. Let's not go in. And God's like, fine. For 40 years, you're going to wander around in the wilderness until you all die. And so a whole generation dies. Moses dies in the wilderness. Right after that, Joshua takes over, and we call it the conquest. Here's a sword. So now as you're like looking in your Bible, conquest, this is these people of Israel going into this land that was promised to Abraham and his descendants, and they are like slaughtering and taking over. And everyone says, or thinks, oh, that's evil. God is using this nation Israel to judge other wicked nations. God's in charge. He's the one who decided it, so don't judge God for that. So this is Joshua, and he goes in and takes over the land. After Joshua comes our judges, right? So this is a gavel. I don't know how good of a drawer I am, but so that's the gavel. So then you got the conquest, and then you got judges. So for about 400 years, Israel was ruled. God is in charge, and the judges were there. And finally, they were like, you know what? The priests are kind of creepy. They're doing wrong stuff. We want a king. God's like, no, okay, fine. So God gives them a king. And so this is all 12 tribes together. All the 12 tribes of Israel. This is their thing. And then finally Israel says, we want a king. And God's like, all right, fine. You get Saul. So Saul is a king. We call this a united kingdom. Of all 12 tribes, they all had basically, think of like the United States, we have different states. They had like 12 states, and each tribe had their own state. So all 12 were together, and Saul was the king. And then after Saul comes David, and then after David, Solomon. So these three kings, right, of afar, I always remember, were all united. There was 12, all 12 tribes were like one united group, and they were all together. But something happens after this. So you got the three kings in the United Kingdom, and then in 931 BC, something happens. The kingdom's divided. And you have the northern kingdom, which is 10 tribes, and then you have the southern, which is 2 tribes. And the northern tribes, they're called Israel, and the southern tribes are called Judah. Now the northern tribes, prophets will come and preach to them. We're going along, and then in 722 BC, Assyria comes and takes them away. Because they broke the law so many times, God says, I'm going to judge you, I'm promising to do this. So they send prophets, and eventually in 722 BC, Assyria comes, this wicked nation that's kind of taken over everybody, takes these 10 tribes and ships them off to wherever. Judah, the southern tribes, they're a little better. So they don't, like Assyria kind of like comes like to the door and like knocks on the door, but they don't get taken captive until 586 BC, when a new player was in town, which is Babylon. And Babylon overtook Assyria. They had basically whatever Assyria owned, which was probably these 10 tribes. So Babylon is now the world ruler, and they take Judah, these 2 tribes, and they ship them off. And they ship them off to Babylon. And this is where Daniel takes place. And so during this time, it was 70 years they were shipped off. And we call this the captivity, 70 years of captivity. The temple was destroyed. Bad stuff happened. It was bad. So 70 years they were in captivity. And then after that 70 years, they got to come back. So Ezra and Nehemiah are the books talking about them returning back to this land, to the promised land. And then the latter minor prophets are prophets who preach and talk about this time. So this is after this is called the exile time. That's captivity. So once they return, then you got the people back in the land again. And we call this the post-exile. And then, basically with Malachi, God stops talking. You get about 400 years here, and then Jesus shows up. So the Old Testament, once you kind of get a big flow, you start to get into the kings. Sometimes it gets confusing. Israel's a northern tribe. Judah's a southern tribe. Northern tribes got taken by Assyria. Southerns by Babylon. I always remember the order, A and then B. It's like my little mental trick. They go to exile for 70 years. And over all of this, why is God interacting and judging in these ways? Is because they are under the law. They are in contracts with God that says, if you do these things, you'll be blessed. If you do things, you will be cursed. And so he sends the prophets during these times to say, you're breaking the law again. You're becoming idolatrous. I'm going to take you captive. I'm going to send you away. And God fulfills what he says. But God is also a God of promise, and he promises to one day restore Israel. So that's our mega survey of the Old Testament to give you just an understanding. So as you study and read, you'll see where things go.